Hello and welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be taking a look at the Missouri Democratic and Republican primaries ahead of Tuesday's primary elections. Now on Tuesday we're going to be looking at a number of primaries on election night, as well as the Kansas abortion referendum. All of that will be on our election night live stream. The link to that will be posted tomorrow. But today we're going to take a look at the state of Missouri and two decently competitive primaries. Now, throughout this primary season, we really haven't had a lot of high-profile competitive Democratic primaries. I mean, the closest we really had, I guess, was Maryland recently. But in Missouri, we've had up until recently, a pretty competitive primary. Lucas Kunce, the progressive Democratic candidate, early on was leading in the polls, and now establishment Democrat or generic Democrat Trudy Busch Valentine now has the lead in the latest polls. The Emerson College poll has her up by 4 points, and the Survey USA poll has her up by a landslide margin over Lucas Kunce. Now, why I thought this primary was so interesting was because early on, Lucas Kunce, who is the more progressive candidate, was running unapologetically as a progressive in a red state like Missouri, and he was doing that to excite the Democratic base for the primary. Now, Missouri, as of the 2020 election, is not a very Democratic state. In fact, Joe Biden only got 41% of the vote here. But Lucas Kunce himself was probably banking on Republican Eric Greitens, who we'll talk about later, winning the GOP nomination, because that would give him the best chance to pull an upset. And I think even he realizes that pulling an upset in a state as red as Missouri is extremely, extremely difficult, especially given the midterm environment and how much Missouri has trended Republican since 2008. So early on, his campaign was pretty successful as billing himself as the fighter that would bring jobs back to Missouri and ultimately rally the Democratic base toward him, pitching himself as the electable candidate in this race that would be able to beat Eric Greitens in the primary. Because early on, and we'll talk about this when we get to the Republicans, but Eric Greitens was the favorite for a decent amount of time in the Republican primary, and he is a very scandal-ridden candidate. And in head-to-head pollings, he's really only up by about 4 or 5 points against really any of the Democrats. So that's one of the reasons why I think Lucas Kunce originally was doing so well. He sort of was campaigning against Greitens, and he was running a very, very progressive liberal campaign in the primary, which excited Democratic-based voters. But the national Democrats have all rallied behind Trudy Busch Valentine, poured in millions of dollars. She's a billionaire herself, put a lot of her own money into this race. And ultimately, it looks like she's going to run away with this primary, although I wouldn't be surprised if Lucas Kunce does end up winning some rural, redder counties in the primary race on Tuesday. Lucas Kunce is from the Jefferson City area, so I expect him to do probably pretty well there, but I think Trudy Busch Valentine will probably electorally crush him in other parts of the state. Again, the polling is a bit wonky in this primary. The latest poll has her up by a margin I didn't really expect, but all three of the latest polls do have her up ahead over Kunce. I still think he's probably being underestimated in these polls, but at the end of the day, I see him maybe getting about 35 to 37% maybe, and Trudy Busch Valentine probably getting somewhere around 55% of the vote. Again, primary predictions, I am not really confident in my margins because primaries, state by state are very different and somewhat unpredictable, but my prediction here is that Trudy Busch Valentine will be the Democratic nominee out of Missouri. Moving on down to the Republicans, this was definitely also a very contentious primary. Eric Greitens, the former scandal-ridden governor of Missouri, who had sexual assault allegations against him. I'll stress that they were allegations. They were not proven in a court of law, innocent until proven guilty. But nonetheless, these allegations severely hurt him among not just Republicans, but also the wider Missouri electorate. And if we take a look at the polls in the general election, we see this bearing out. Eric Greitens in head-to-head matchups with Lucas Kunce, who, mind you, is a very progressive candidate running in a red state. He only beats Kunce by 3.5 points in the aggregate. Now, you could say, well, early polls favor Democrats, and then as we get closer to Election Day, these polls would widen in favor of Greitens. But Missouri does have a history of close Senate races, even in years where Republicans are favored. And I think that's mainly because candidate quality is still a big factor in midterm elections and just elections in general. And, I'll make a video probably after the Tuesday primaries about the Republicans' current situation in the midterms and why they're not really polling as well as they should be given the national circumstances, given the fact that the country is on track to enter or is entering a recession, and Biden's approval rating is in the high 30s at this point. So under normal circumstances, the Republicans would be running away with this. They'd be up in the generic ballot, 8 points, 10 points, 6 points, whatever, in various polls. But we're not seeing that. And in other states, swing states, competitive races, we're not really seeing that either. In House races, there seems to be a disparity because in House races, Republicans are still doing well and are on track to win the House. But in Senate races, in these early polls, they are struggling. So I will make a video kind of covering that at length. But in Missouri, this is still a factor. If we go back to 2016, Roy Blunt, who was an incumbent Republican at this time, was nearly defeated by Democrat Jason Kander in a year where President Donald Trump carried the state of Missouri by almost 20 percentage points. So a huge drop. I think it's a 15-point drop-off in support from Donald Trump to Roy Blunt. And Jason Kander, I think, was a phenomenal candidate in terms of electability. For a Democrat, he was socially moderate and campaigned on the issues that I think everyday Missourians cared about. He talked about healthcare, he talked about jobs in the economy, and he shied away from liberal social positions that would hurt him in a red state like Missouri. He was a much more moderate candidate, opposed TPP, which was a big issue in the 2016 election cycle, and is a very unpopular proposal in the Midwest. And that got him a wide range of support. Kander was a statewide official. He was the Secretary of State of Missouri, I believe. And, he had rural margins that Democrats would never get today anymore. And, it really is the death of the rural Democratic Party around the country. This is sort of the last stand for the Missouri Democrats in that regard. Jason Kander got the closest of any Democrat to win statewide office since. But if we take a look at the polls again for the Republican primary, so far it looks like Eric Schmidt is the favorite to win the primary. Currently, he's up by about 8.5%. That was not the case just a couple of weeks ago where Eric Greitens was the favorite to win the primary. If we go back, really back until early June, Eric Greitens was still consistently leading in the polling. And mind you, he was the nominee that was polling by far the weakest against the Democratic opponents. But he was running arguably the most right-wing campaign. He famously released that ad that stirred a lot of controversy about him being a rhino hunter and him holding his shotgun up to find and root out the rhinos in Washington, D.C. So he was kind of running this red meat campaign for the base, and that's a very smart way to run in a primary. But in terms of the general election, those things would definitely hurt him. And really, for Eric Greitens, it was the alleged personal scandals that really doomed his political candidacy. Many national Republicans were worried about him getting the nomination because ultimately he would be a weaker candidate, even if the allegations against him aren't true. And again, they haven't been proven in a court of law. But it doesn't matter. When the general electorate sees allegations like that, they tend to shy away. And, Kunce probably would focus on more of his popular positions on issues like Medicare, healthcare expansion, infrastructure, his Marshall Plan for the Midwest, which would be very popular with blue-collar workers. But ultimately, Kunce would still lose by a pretty sizable margin because he is a progressive in a deep red state, and he's running a very socially progressive campaign. Kander didn't really do that. He was a social moderate. He was somebody who would buck the Democratic Party line on certain issues that were unpopular in his state. Kunce is unapologetically progressive, and while that's very good for the base, it's not good in a general election in a Republican wave year. Still likely to be a year where Republicans are favored, but also in a red state. Now, if we go back to 2018, this was a blue wave year around the country, but in the state of Missouri, Josh Hawley beat incumbent Democratic Senator Claire McCaskill by almost 6 percentage points. Now, the reason why Hawley was able to win despite it being a blue wave year is because of how much Missouri has shifted to the right. Even though the nation was voting for Democrats by about 8 to 9 percentage points, Missouri still ousted their incumbent Democratic senator. Now, McCaskill was lucky because in 2012, in a year where she likely would have been in danger just based on the national environment in Missouri, Missouri ended up going to Romney by a sizable margin, a likely margin, whereas in 2008 it barely went to John McCain. Claire McCaskill had the benefit of running against Todd Akin, who really was an awful candidate for the state of Missouri and, super controversial, not really a good campaigner. Really focused on unpopular social issues, even in a state like Missouri, which was still a Republican-leaning state. McCaskill capitalized on his unpopular stances on abortion and a number of other controversial opinions he held, and ultimately she ended up winning that race by a pretty sizable margin. But in 2018, she was running against a strong candidate, Josh Hawley, who was the Attorney General of Missouri at the time. And ultimately, because Missouri had shifted so far to the right compared to where it was in 2012 and 2006 when Claire McCaskill won her previous elections, Josh Hawley ended up winning by a pretty comfortable margin at the end of the day. So when we take a look ahead at the general election in 2022, I still suspect that Missouri will be a safe Republican state, mainly because I think Eric Schmidt will end up winning the nomination. Originally the Republican primary had a lot of competitive candidates early on. You had Mark McCloskey, who became famous really because he brandished a gun outside of his home during a Black Lives Matter march through his neighborhood. So that kind of catapulted him into stardom. So he decided to run for Senate, but ultimately that social media fame didn't really materialize into any real support. Early on, the closest he ever got was only down by about 3 points to Billy Long, and after that, Billy Long, McCloskey, they really weren't competitive candidates in this primary at the end of the day. It really came down to Eric Schmidt and Eric Greitens, the two Erics of the primary, and for a brief period, Vicky Hartzler, although I think once Trump sort of released his statements on his dislike for Vicky Hartzler, that kind of tanked her campaign, because people don't realize how much of an impact Donald Trump's anti-endorsement does have in primaries. Trump's endorsement is very powerful in Republican primaries, but I would say an anti-endorsement is almost more powerful. And there's very few exceptions where somebody who was openly anti-endorsed by Trump, say Brian Kemp, for instance, ends up winning their primary. It's a very rare situation, and I think in Missouri that really hurt Hartzler because there kind of was a three-way race for a period of time between Schmidt, Hartzler, and Greitens. Ultimately, Hartzler sort of really overshadowed Greitens, and now it's really between her and Schmidt in the latest poll. But ultimately, my prediction is Eric Schmidt will come in first place. I actually think Eric Greitens will come in second, a close second, and then, of course, you'll have Vicky Hartzler as third. A close second between Vicky Hartzler, not Eric Schmidt. I think at the end of the day, Eric Schmidt will probably win by about 11 or 12 points. Then he'll have Eric Greitens underneath him, and then Vicky Hartzler probably neck and neck for second down there, and the other candidates way at the bottom. Those are my predictions for the Democratic and Republican primaries in the Show Me state. Let me know what your thoughts are down below in the comment section. Like this video if you enjoyed, and as always, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.